The Chargers have scheduled tons of interviews with guys that we don't really want as head coach. People like Patrick Graham, Kellen Moore, Giff Smith, Raheem Morris, Steve Wilks. I mean, the list goes on forever, but there are almost a dozen guys reported, but they still haven't reportedly interviewed Jim Harbaugh yet. They also interviewed 5 candidates so far for their general manager position, and the best one, in my opinion, is Cunningham, but they lost out on maybe the best GM candidate on the market today when Adam Peters was hired by the Washington Commanders. So what are they doing, and should we be worried? Well, make sure to like and subscribe if you do enjoy this content, man. It helps me out so much. And let me tell you why I'm not too concerned right now. The Chargers have said before they even started conducting these interviews that they were going to cast a wide net and keep an open mind, which is why they're scheduling so many interviews with guys that, I mean, let's just be honest, they're not likely to be a head coach of this team and really of any other team in the NFL right now. I don't think it's likely that the Chargers hire either Kellen Moore or Giff Smith or whoever they just interviewed today. I think it was Patrick Graham, the Raiders defensive coordinator. He's not going to be head coach, man. But they gave those guys interviews in order to do their due diligence and get their input on what they would do as head coach if they were given the opportunity. And that is a key takeaway from all of these interviews, all right? Not only are they interviewing these coaches for a job, but they are also picking their brain and trying to get as many different viewpoints on how their roster is constructed and where to go from here as they possibly can. And that's what comes with interviewing so many different guys from so many different football backgrounds and even different football eras, man. Like Bill Belichick and Leslie Frazier are from a different football era than guys like Ben Johnson. You get a bunch of different skill sets and philosophies that you can learn from and try to apply some of those on your team, whether or not you hire that candidate. And that is just how you do business, man. I promise you, in these interviews, they're asking these coaches, what should we do and where do we go from here? And they're going to receive a lot of different answers that they're going to be writing down and hopefully telling Jim Harbaugh everything that they wrote down so that Jim Harbaugh can make that final decision and say, okay, this is what we do. So you should not be concerned about all of these different head coaching reported interviews going on right now. And you shouldn't be concerned that they have not been reportedly interviewing Jim Harbaugh, Mike Vrabel, or Bill Belichick. Those are the 3 biggest names right now because it's only been like a week. And just because it's not reported, man, that doesn't mean that it's not being discussed or that it isn't happening or it hasn't happened already. I promise you, Jim Harbaugh has been closely in contact with the Chargers, and he's probably just enjoying that national championship victory for a little while before he gets back to work again. And maybe he does an interview or 2 as a formality while the Chargers start looking for a GM candidate to fill out their front office. And that was a report that came out a while back as well, that the Chargers will be conducting interviews for both positions simultaneously, and they're not committed to hiring one position before the other. So they could hire a general manager before Jim Harbaugh or some other coach if it isn't Jim Harbaugh. That would be incredibly disappointing for me. But the Chargers have only interviewed 5 general manager candidates so far, and they haven't interviewed the guy that is often connected to Jim Harbaugh, Ed Dobbs. And Ed Dobbs was with the Raiders when Jim Harbaugh was a coach there, and they're pretty close and often connected when a team is considering hiring one of them. A lot of people think that if you hire Jim Harbaugh, then you will get Ed Dobbs and vice versa. But I don't think that's really a certainty. I mean, yeah, they could be homies, but that does not mean that you should write them off as a pairing. The Raiders are looking likely to hire Ed Dobbs right now as their GM, and they might get Jim Harbaugh because of that. You know, I could be wrong, but I think it is way more likely that Jim Harbaugh values the team that he is going to over working with Ed Dobbs again. There are a ton of great football minds that Jim Harbaugh is connected to. You just have to look into it, man. An easy connection that I can make right now is the Ravens front office, where John Harbaugh is connected to everybody, and the Chargers could hire 2 different guys from there that are legit GM candidates, Cunningham and Joe Hortiz. Both have big ties to the Ravens and Jim Harbaugh, and I made a video about them, so check that out for more information on those 2 guys if you're interested. But the idea that Jim Harbaugh does not want to work with anybody other than Ed Dobbs at GM, it's kind of dumb to me. Remember the report that came out that Jim Harbaugh wanted the Chargers job last year, but it wasn't available? He would have been working with Tom Telesco, and he does not even have a job anymore. So I don't think the GM position is something that Jim Harbaugh is saying it is make or break. He values the team and the quarterback, like Justin Herbert, that he's going to be coaching way more than possibly hooking up with his homie Ed Dobbs again. And don't take that out of context. That sounded a little weird. And listen, I'm not saying that he doesn't want to work with Ed Dobbs, but I am saying that I don't think it is nearly as important to him as people make it out to be. And he would be in just as good of a position with a GM like Joe Hortiz or Ian Cunningham or even Mike Borgonzi from the Chiefs, man. And conveniently, again, I made a video about all three of those guys. I really encourage you to check it out because I'm sure one of those guys will be the GM of the Chargers unless they screw it up. And I am a little bit disappointed that Adam Peters is not the Chargers general manager, but there are still tons of other good GM candidates. And if we get Jim Harbaugh, I think that is the main concern right now, is whether or not we get Jim Harbaugh. That is something that I think must happen in order to get success in the near future. And I would also expect all of the GMs that are being interviewed right now to have an understanding that the Chargers are full court pressing Jim Harbaugh right now for head coach. So if they don't think they would fit well with him, then they would just take their name out of the running. It is not a secret that the Chargers and Jim Harbaugh are heavily interested in each other, and I'm assuming that the GM and the Chargers organization would not only bring that up in the interview, but discuss how to build the team and work with Jim Harbaugh specifically as the head coach. And I actually think that's probably one of the main things that they're talking about. What would you do with the cap right now? What positions do you value over others? And can you draft guys that Jim Harbaugh wants to coach? And maybe they're even asking him, hey, can you deal with a guy like Jim Harbaugh as the head coach? Because there are also reports that Jim Harbaugh can be difficult to deal with. And I do think often those reports can be over-exaggerated on how much of a nuisance Jim Harbaugh can be in the building. I think in order to avoid conflict with that, Jim Harbaugh is a real big football guy, right? You need a football guy as a general manager, someone like Mike Borgonzi, like I said, or Ian Cunningham. Both of those guys played football a lot, and both of them, you know, Ian Cunningham is a former lineman, so he knows how to draft linemen. Mike Borgonzi, former fullback. And you cannot be more of a football guy other than an offensive lineman and a freaking fullback, man. I don't think either of those guys would have issues with Jim Harbaugh as the head coach. So don't be discouraged or tricked into thinking the Chargers are going to hire like Steve Wilks or Raheem Morris as the head coach just because of the reported interviews this week. Remember, it hasn't even been a week since Jim Harbaugh has coached his last game at Michigan. I would expect him to be hired or at least like interviewed by the end of next week. And as far as the general manager goes, I don't know whether or not they're going to hire a GM before Jim Harbaugh or not. But if I were to guess, I'd say that they just interview the GM candidates right now until the Harbaugh hire is finalized, just in case. And then they go get either Ian Cunningham or Mike Borgonzi. Those are my top two guys. With Adam Peters gone, I would have loved Adam Peters. But if you want to check out my video on some of these GM candidates, you can click right here.